Carmen Melendrez has a PhD in Cell Developmental Biology from the University of California, Davis. She was awarded prestigious fellowships from the General Electric Foundation and the National Institutes of Health to conduct her doctoral research, which is published in peer-reviewed journals. Since leaving bench science, she has worked with world leaders and wide-ranging community stakeholders, including youth, on global strategic initiatives. She is a co-founder of Wisdom University, a graduate school based in San Francisco in the Bay Area, which has expanded into Ubiquity University and now serves as a research development professional in a faculty capacity at the University of New Mexico. Her passion lies in promoting multidisciplinary and transdisciplinary research that addresses urgent community, national, and global needs through innovation and inclusion. Doctora Melendrez lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and is a community activist. She works on projects to end homelessness and supports researchers working to enable deaf children in Africa to acquire signed language. She also supports animal causes, including rescuing animals from poor living conditions. It is my great pleasure to present to you Doctora Carmen Melendrez.
Thank you so much, Danielle. That was so kind of you. Valerie, Flora. I think there's a couple of other women that I've recognized from Mexico and Querétaro last year in January. I'm not sure because you've grown and matured so much in 17 months. As Danielle mentioned, the first time that I participated, I was at UNM, and all of the girls, the cohort, descended on our campus, and I was so honored to be able to speak to you at that time. Last year, I had the wonderful honor of being in Querétaro, Mexico with Flora and her team that had done such an amazing job to organize, again, another cohort in person. And here we are now in Zoom, in virtual world. I find that particularly interesting because I think the need to be flexible in the world that we are living in right now is going to be so critical. I think if there's, any bit of advice that I could give other than what Regent Begay gave you, and there's very little I would have to offer, that is be flexible. And be creative and open-minded to anything that you encounter, because from here on in, I think it's going to be a fast roller coaster ride, and there's going to be so little that we're going to be able to predict. I'm going to share my screen just so that I can get started. I had originally thought of doing what Regent Begay did, and that was just talk. But, there were so many wonderful images that I thought I could share with you this morning in regards to what I'm going to talk about. So first of all, I just loved this image. It captured just about everything that I was going to talk about. First of all, innovation. That is my new favorite word, innovation. It's not something that I had ever been involved in before. As Danielle pointed out, I'm a cell biologist. I have a master's in biochemistry and undergraduate degrees in chemistry and animal science. Innovation was never something that I thought I would be involved in. To me, that meant the business sector. And I always knew I wasn't interested in working to make money or to make a profit. I always knew somehow, even as a child, that I was interested in helping people, helping communities, helping society. I love the choices that are ahead of you here, this bright, beautiful green future, or, the opposite of that. And I love the idea of a woman working in science and STEM, helping to create innovations that will lead to the green part of that picture. At the end, I'll tell you what I think is missing from this picture, but let's go on. So Danielle helped me to come up with this theme, and at the time, I just thought it was great. But as I really began to work on putting this presentation together, and I didn't spend time putting a presentation together, I was going to tell you some stories like Regent Begay did, and I'm so grateful that I get to follow her and that she just spoke from her heart, because I didn't really want to read from a script. This life isn't really a script, but this whole idea of perspectives from practice, convergence of academia and social action. And I feel, as I pointed out, that my whole life has been about social action, and yet the majority of my life has been spent in academia. And there was a time that those two were completely separate from each other, and that at this point in my life, they've come together, they've converged. I just think is a fascinating story. And it's not because it's my life, it's because what's come to pass is just so necessary from my perspective. So I thought that this would be what would be presented. And then I realized I wrote everything saying I. And so it was suggested that I just go ahead and read this to you. So this will be the only part that I read. I'm going to read it to you because it just poured out of me, and I wasn't really thinking about what I was going to say. So I think that's the most pivotal, when something just comes out of you. Upon completion of my doctorate in Cell and Developmental Biology at the University of California, Davis, which concluded 13 years of college, 15 years of research, and 4 STEM degrees, I chose to leave bench science and enter the world of international relations and social activism with the Gorbachev Foundation USA. The organization was founded in 1993 in one of America's most hallowed military posts, the Presidio of San Francisco. I joined the organization as a volunteer while in graduate school, as I become very interested in global politics and international relations midway through my doctorate. And I'll tell you a little bit about how that came about in the next slide. It was easy to become immersed in the network of world leaders and community activists focused on wide-ranging strategic initiatives, from the elimination of nuclear weapons to coexistence and community building in a globalizing world. For you, you've inherited a world that is globalized. I entered it during the course of my lifetime, just to show you how much has changed. Being new in this arena, I immediately embraced the social focus and the action-oriented work. I spent the next 13 years engaged in political activism and social action before returning to academia. Coming full circle to the place of my origins was not something I sought. Rather, it feels as though academia sought me out. It was difficult at first to reconcile the outward-looking activist spirit that had compelled me for so many years with the siloed and inward-looking ivory towers of academia. But it was not long before both worlds converged, and I began to chart a new course, a path less traveled by both activists and academics, but a path meant to be my own. And I hope that the rest of my story explains that a little more carefully. Growing up, I have a very similar story as to Regent Vigues. My grandmother, my mother's mother, my abuelita Julia, was one of the smartest, most impressionable women of my life next to my mother. But she grew up in a family where the men did not believe women should be educated. So she only made it to 3rd grade. But her path in life was to never let that deter her from continuing to learn. But what I remember the most about my grandma was being a little girl and my mother taking my sister and I to my grandma's house. She didn't live far from 2 of her sisters and her mother, my great-grandmother Raquel. And we would walk to my great-grandmother's house, all these women together. At Christmas, we would get together and make tamales and food. We were always together as a community. They had their children. We would always be playing together. There were neighbors that would come and ask for sugar or manteca. Sometimes my grandmother would send me to Angelitas to ask for something that maybe she needed while we were cooking. There was a little store, a little tiendita, just across the block from my grandma's house. And sometimes we would just be playing around there, and the owner would come out and he would give us candy. And when my grandma found out, she would give us money and we would have to go pay him for the candy. And then he would just let us buy more candy. It didn't happen very often. We were very poor, but those moments just really taught me that I didn't have to worry in my life. I had a community of people that loved me and cared for me and watched out for me. So you can imagine how surprising it was. And I believe it was 1983. I had graduated from high school and was entering college when it says 87, I apologize. when Margaret Thatcher, who was the first woman prime minister of the greatest country for a long period of time, who had conquered the majority of the planet, if you want to consider that great, the United Kingdom, Margaret Thatcher became the first prime minister. And I heard on the news that she had had an interview where she said, and you know, there's no such thing as society. There are individual men and women and their families. And she goes on to say, who pull themselves up by their bootstraps. That's a common saying in English for you do everything on your own. So if you pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you stand up on your own. So I remembered thinking, I wonder what she means is there's no such thing as society. To me, at that time, society meant people. And so if there weren't people coming together to help you and you were on your own, what had changed? Because I grew up in a family where we all helped each other. Our community, the neighbors watched out for us. We all helped each other. To think that this was the leader of a great country saying these kinds of things at a pivotal time in the history of Western civilization. So I want us to think about that. And I want you to think right now, I wish I could do these cool polls. I'd like to poll you to find out how many of you actually agree with her statement that there's no such thing as the collective of people. There's just individual people who are taking care of themselves. But since I can't do that, I'll just ask you to think about it. And maybe at the end, we can do a little session where each of you maybe gives your thoughts about what this kind of a statement from a world leader might mean to you, especially a woman. Because for me, it was always the women that brought society together, that brought the family and community together. The men always showed up and they did their part, but it was the women that seemed to be very nurturing of community. So fast forward, I'm in graduate school at UC Davis. I'm working on my doctorate. It's my second year in my doctorate program. And although there's lots of different ways that academic institutions test you and allow you to either move forward or not, at UC Davis, it was about in your second or third year, and we called it a qualifying exam. So I had done some research for a couple of years that gave me enough of a basis to be able to propose what it was that I was going to do for my doctoral thesis. But I had to go in front of a committee of faculty who I already knew because I'd been taking classes with them. But in this qualifying exam, they could ask me anything. And I had heard where they asked you things about politics or something that was happening in the world, but mainly they stuck to your field. Well, cell and developmental biology is a huge field. So my advisor said to me, you should take a couple of months off and do nothing but, you've done enough research, just stay at home, go to the library, read as much as you can and learn as much as you can in order to be sure that you're going to pass your qualifying exam. So I had these piles of paperwork on my table, and I'd start at like 7 in the morning and work till 7 at night. And I'm reading through these papers and book chapters. And I'm thinking to myself, oh my God, how am I going to pass? I don't know anything. And yet, as I was reading through all of these papers, well, I knew that, and I knew that, and I kept reading through material, and the pile of things that I knew kept getting bigger, and the pile of things that I was sure I didn't know was getting smaller. But I've always been really active. I'm so grateful to have a mother that was very young. She was 21 when she had me, and my brother and sister were a year apart ahead of me. And so we lived way out in the middle of nowhere, literally just the open desert. We had wonderful animals, horses, sheep, cows, pigs, chickens, ducks, dogs and cats. That's my love of animals. And we would just always be outside, very active. And my mother would play with us, and we would ride bicycles, and we would take walks to the river, which was amazing. And so here I was now for like a month and a half, just sitting studying, and feeling that if I spent any moment doing anything else, that I wasn't going to learn everything that I needed to know. And the date of my qualifying exam was set. So I've never had a television, but I was in a relationship with a man who had a little black and white TV. And so he was off at work, and I decided one day that I was going to jump around and do some exercises while watching the news at noon. I just set the marker for noon. So I turned on the television and these images popped up. The first one in the upper left, as you can see, was actually a little bit more striking than the one on the lower right. You see this man reaching out his hand to another man who's looking at him and not quite ready to put out his hand. Obviously, in our culture, shaking hands means trust. It means moving forward if there had been a problem. And you can see that's President Clinton, who I knew because I got to actually vote for him. That was the first presidential election that I got to vote. And I had so much hope for the world when, we had a Democratic leader. And so you can see he's really trying to bring these two men together. And finally, the guy on the left decides he's going to shake the other guy's hand. And this is what the headlines read. Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin shook hands in the South Lawn of the White House. This event was watched through television by many millions of people around the world. Two former arch enemies shaking hands. It was called a new, unprecedented, and promising chapter in the Arab-Israeli relations. So this was in the newspaper the next day because I had to figure out what this was about. But at the time, they were saying, finally, there's peace in the Middle East. So I'm working on my PhD. I have these 3 other degrees behind me. I think I would know a little bit about what's happening in the world. How can there be peace? That means there was a war. And if there was a war happening in the world, how could I not know about it? And furthermore, they were talking about the Middle East. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, so there's north, south, east, and west. But what's the Middle East? So that night, my mother called me and she said, I want to send you a little gift. What can I send you? What can I send you that's going to help you as you prepare for this, really important exam? And I was the first in my family, very large extended family. My great grandmother had 13 children. Unfortunately, only 8 lived to be adults, and each of them had a bunch of children. And my dad's side of the family, he had 7 brothers and sisters. There were 8 of them. And I was the only one in the family to ever even think about working on a PhD. So my mother was so proud of me. And for me, it was just a lot of hard work. It was hard to be proud at that time. So I said, Mom, I was watching something on the news today, and they were talking about peace in the Middle East. And I'm trying to figure out, first of all, where the Middle East is. And this was pre-internet. I know you can't imagine a time before the internet, but the internet was just emerging. And so we didn't have Google, and there was no way I could go on and figure out, who these guys were, what the problem was. I said, but there's been some kind of a war, and I don't know how I cannot know about this. So can you send me a history book and a globe? So a couple of days later, I opened the door to my apartment and I look on the ground and there's a newspaper. And I'm thinking, I didn't pay for this newspaper. I'm a poor, starving graduate student. I'm not going to pick up something that isn't mine. But I'm really interested, and I look around, there's nobody around. So I grab the newspaper and I start to read it. And that opened up the world for me. I was completely unaware of the world around me because I thought my world was my lab, which, to take a couple of steps back, when my advisor, Dr. Stan Meisel, one of the most preeminent biochemists in the world, said to me, I'm going to let you work on your doctorate in my lab. You're going to have to get past your qualifying exam. But I want you to know that this is not a collaborative effort. You do not interact with the other graduate students. You don't ask questions of the postdocs. And the lab tech isn't here to wash your lab equipment. Everything that you do, you are going to be doing on your own. You're going to be judged on what contributions you make to science. And interestingly, after the qualifying exam, there were no other exams where anybody was going to test me. The test was going to be the research community in my field, who was going to judge my research through my publications as worthy or not. The final test to graduate was publishing 3 articles in peer-reviewed journals. That means that the world's experts were going to be reviewing my publications that I was going to write up with the results of my work. And if I could get 3 of those, then I was going to be able to graduate. But they weren't judging me based on what I was going to be doing with my colleagues, people that I studied with, my lab mates. They were going to be judging me based on what I did alone. At the time, the weight of the world was on my shoulders because I'd never really done anything alone. Anything I ever needed, my mom, my sister, my grandmother, my family was always there to help me. How is it that Margaret Thatcher was right, that there was no society? It was just me and what I could accomplish in that lab. And I tell you, I didn't have a lot of help with my family growing up. I had to learn just about everything in terms of academia that I was being judged with or judged over. And so this was a really scary time for me, but watching this on television was so pivotal and eye-opening for me because I realized that even though I was in this lab 12, 14, 16, sometimes up to 24 hours a day because I'd start experiments and I was testing different time periods between these different actions, and I'd be in the lab for 24 hours. And this opened up a world way beyond the medical school at the edge of one little campus that was one of 7 at the time of the University of California system in one state in the whole world. So this was just like so pivotal for me. So as you heard from the story, I get my PhD and I decide I'm not interested in spending the rest of my life characterizing a molecule on the membrane, the outer membrane of a cell. First of all, my degree was cell biology. And I can't tell you the last time the cell was even relevant in my work. The first thing I would do is I'd disrupt the cells and I'd try to isolate and characterize one molecule on the surface of that cell. I could see the future. The future was doing that over and over and over again for the rest of my life. And already this amazing world had opened up to me. So I had started doing little things like going to Foothills College in the South Bay area, which would host one-day events about once a quarter. If I remember correctly, it was like $95 to attend the whole day, but they had really phenomenal speakers coming, people that I won't mention because you won't know them. It was a long time ago, but one of them was Colin Powell. He had just stepped down from his military post before he became the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff some years later for George Bush Jr., who you may remember, he was the face of the world. And he's the one who came on television and said, Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, which turned out to be a lie. And that was really unfortunate for him because he was one of the first Black people to enter that rank in politics. But I remember him speaking. He was overseeing an organization called AmeriCorps, and he was working with young people across the country trying to raise money to help them get workforce development so that they could go out and get, good jobs. I attended several of these because I didn't have the money to attend all of them. And we would get these little box lunches and I'd go sit at a table with a bunch of people I didn't know. And they were all so smart about what was happening in the world. And I didn't, because I would leave the lab and leave my experiments running so I could drive down to Foothills College so that I could listen to these people talk. To make a long story short, I just fell in love with the world, with politics, with what was happening in the world. But there was no real way I was going to enter the world of politics or international relations with a degree in cell biology, or so I thought. So one day I'm moving out of an apartment, and the only two things left was a coffee table, and the San Francisco Chronicle was on there. That's a newspaper from San Francisco, and a telephone. And it wasn't a cell phone. We didn't have those at the time. It was this big clunky plastic phone that you literally dialed in order to call a phone. So I knocked the newspaper over because we're going to be moving the coffee table out into the U-Haul, and the newspaper falls open into the middle page. And it was a 2-page spread saying world leaders gather in San Francisco to talk about, all these relevant issues. And I said, excuse me, I've got to read this. So I read it, and it said, for information, contact James Garrison at the Gorbachev Foundation. And it had the phone number, 415-561-2345. I will never forget that phone number. I ran to the phone, dialed the number, and this woman answers. And I said, can I speak with James? I knew that if I called him in any other way, they would know that I didn't know him. But if I pretended that I knew him by calling him James, he would take my call, right? So the woman said, I'm sorry, Jim Garrison's on another line. Can I ask what this is about? And at that point, I knew I was busted. So I said, I'm reading about this conference. It's happening in maybe a month's time, and I have to be there. What do I do to be at this conference? And she said, well, there's a registration fee of $5,000. And I almost fell over because I so wanted to be there, but I knew that there was no way I was going to come up with $5,000. So I said, well, I'm a graduate student and I don't have that kind of money, but I can help in any way. I can do whatever is needed. And they said, yeah, why don't you come in and we'll find something for you to do as a volunteer. And when I read to you at the beginning about this hallowed military outpost in the Presidio, President Clinton had given the keys to the Presidio at the time. It was going to be a big park that was going to rival the big United Nations headquarters outside of Geneva in Switzerland. This was going to be for nonprofits, and that was the hope for it. Unfortunately, now it's just a bunch of big, beautiful houses that very wealthy people have been able to buy because it has the most gorgeous views of the bay and the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge. If you've ever seen that, it's just breathtaking. So I drive up and I'm driving around trying to find where this office is. And I'm thinking it's definitely not that office down there on the beach overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. Well, sure enough, that was the office. So I would sneak away from my lab, not sneak away. I was almost done with my, I was completely done with my research. I was now just writing my dissertation. And so I would drive down to San Francisco as often as I could. And I had the job of making all the badges that the people were going to wear. And, I made Mr. Gorbachev's badge and the badge of all of these amazing people from around the world. There was not only this leadership network of people who had held official political posts, there were community leaders that were doing amazing things for their communities. There was a youth leadership forum, and some of the money that the people would pay, the $5,000, was used to bring kids from Africa and India and all over the world. They would apply and talk about what they were doing for their communities and their societies. And there were some phenomenal young people. The youngest was 12 years old. And when he spoke, everybody stopped and just listened because he was so articulate. So here I was making the badges for these people and just dreaming about who they were and that someday I'd be working with them. So the day before the conference comes, and much of the office was being moved into the Fairmont Hotel where the leaders were gathering. And they came and said to me, I'm so sorry, there's no role for you. Thank you for all the work you've done. And maybe in the future, you can come back and continue to volunteer for us. So I was so bummed. I get in my little tiny Hyundai Excel. It was a car that could have had 3 wheels, but it had 4. And I'm driving home. It's the middle of the night. I'm crying. I'm so sad that I'm not going to be able to go be a part of this amazing conference that I was hearing so much about as I was sitting on the main floor, like making these badges. And I get home and the phone's ringing and I answer the phone and they said, oh, the graphic designer actually needs an assistant. Would you be willing to come help? And that was the beginning of my time with the Gorbachev Foundation. I finished my doctorate. I submitted my dissertation. It was approved by all my faculty members. And I went through graduation, and I called them up. And I said, I'm graduating. I want to come work for you. Do you have anything that I can do? And they said, yeah, the receptionist position is opening up. Do you want to be the receptionist? And at the time, it made double what I was making in graduate school. And I said, yeah. And I found out that the lowest position in that organization was actually the most powerful, because people would call and they had names like Manaz Afkami. And when she would say her name, I couldn't even pronounce it, much less call the president and say, Manaz Afkami is on the phone for you. But I had a database. And so I put her on hold. I'd quickly look for M-A-A-F, and her name would come up. And so I'd say, Dr. Garrison, Manaz Afkami is on the phone for you. And he said, how in the world were you able to pronounce her name? I said, I looked her up in the database. So obviously I had a lot more capacity than being the receptionist, but I got to know who all of the most important people were, because if he took their calls, they were important. Needless to say, 13 years later, I had the most amazing ride working with communities, dealing with social issues. And I'll never forget the opportunity I had in 2000 to go protest with all of these people. And I couldn't find pictures that captured. There were millions of people showing up to protest the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. But we didn't go there to protest. We went there to meet with the Prime Minister of the Czech Republic at the time, Václav Havel. He had come out of prison to become the prime minister of this country. He had been thrown in prison because he fought in a revolution to take out a dictator. A little bit of the story of Nelson Mandela, but his plight was nowhere near as difficult as Nelson Mandela's. But he invited people from society to come and to talk, because he wanted to be able to take pictures with us showing that, see, we didn't all disagree with the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. These are three of the Bretton Woods institutions that were created after World War II to rebuild Europe, basically. But this was going to be the future of the world, capitalism. And you can see all these people that showed up to protest. And I was somewhere, so anyway, here we met, we're meeting with James Wolfenson from the World Bank and all these other like really important people. And then when the reception was over, we said, let's go protest. Let's go see what the protesters are doing. And we were way at the front. And what you can't see from that picture in the upper left is there were military tanks that were behind this line of police officers. You can see at least one of the tanks at the bottom left. And so we're marching and we're so empowered, you know, we're fighting against capitalism with millions of people all around us. And then we get to this group of police with military tanks behind us, and they're telling us to disband, but we're kind of in the front middle, and you couldn't just like walk out of the crowd. So they started firing, throwing water through these water cannons. And oh my God, it was so painful to have that water at that kind of pressure hitting your body. Everybody was ducking, and unfortunately everybody ran, and we were able to escape that. But that was my first taste of actual activism, not just meeting with world leaders and talking about the things that needed to change, but actually getting into the streets and showing power in numbers, showing that you're there to say, I'm happy to meet with you in a reception. Me, this little girl from New Mexico who had not left New Mexico until I was about 20 years old, here in this country fighting the roots of capitalism. It was so absolutely amazing. And I don't recommend going up against military tanks, but or police, and we know what that can be like at this time. But fast forward to a more modern time, and this relates more to academia now. So a couple of years ago, or no, actually, 2020, last year, so much time has gone by and yet it seems to have stood still. Last year, graduate students across the country in the biggest academic institutions started to protest, saying we want to be able to form a union where we can negotiate with the leaders of academic institutions, with the Board of Regents, as Regent Begay was pointing out. They're in charge. They're more powerful than the president of a university, because they're appointed by the governor to oversee and be the fiscal agents of academic institutions. So here are these young people across the country, graduate students, saying, we're tired of working for such little pay, and we want to form unions. And so it was really amazing to watch these graduate students, because here I am in academia thinking to myself, I don't know, because so many graduate students are willing to take a few $100s to teach a class. I don't know how this is going to work out for them. Well, fortunately, my university, my alma mater, the University of California, which is a series of big academic institutions, was one of the first ones to let students form a union. And so this is a picture of the students waiting to go inside of an office to sign a petition saying that they wanted to organize into a union. And this was really phenomenal to me, because then across the country, all of these other academic institutions had to cave into their graduate students and, oh my God, pay them more money for this amazing work that they were doing. How many graduate students teach the classes that you're in, certainly the labs, and you know they don't make as much money as the professor does, and yet they're teaching you, so clearly they're equally qualified. So this is an example, and I want to go back and read. Our success or failure is tied together. And I just want to plant that seed. Our success or failure is tied together. Now, this is just graduate students wanting a little bit more benefits for themselves to be able to teach the classes that they were teaching. Now comes the Black Lives Matter movement. And I don't know if you all are going to remember where you were at the time that you heard about the killing of George Floyd. A friend was telling me, we were having lunch at a park because we were still in lockdown. And he said, I saw something today on television and it was horrible, and it's going to be big. And I think that a lot's going to come out of it. I came home, made a cardboard sign, Black Lives Matter, and went to the Roundhouse, which is our capital. I knew that there would be people protesting, and I immediately began to protest for Black Lives Matter, never knowing what impact it was going to have. This is the kind of impact that movement and all of the other social movements that have happened, from a group of people coming on the street saying, this can't happen. We're not going to let this keep happening to our Black men. We are going to fight for our rights as human beings. What does that have to do with academia? I just pulled these 3 funding opportunities from some of the biggest foundations in the United States. The first is from the Department of Energy. The Department of Energy funds all of our national laboratories, including Sandia National Laboratory, which make weapons of mass destruction. In addition, they're focused on a few other things that benefit society, because not every innovation, almost any innovation, can be used for good and it can be used for bad. So thankfully, a lot of our national labs are now working on renewable energies and a lot of the problems that we're currently facing. But the Department of Energy's Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy Office, called ERIE, put out this call saying, Department of Energy seeks public feedback on removing barriers to participation in funding programs. The U.S. Department of Energy is releasing a request for information to understand the current barriers and actions needed to make its funding opportunities and innovation and entrepreneurship activities more inclusive, just, and equitable, in line with the administration's climate goals. The Department of Energy is saying, we recognize we've been giving our money to a small group of researchers and academic institutions. So how can we begin to look at giving it to a broader, more inclusive group so that they can go out and become innovators, entrepreneurs, and create solutions to our big global challenges. The William T. Grant Foundation is a private foundation, but one of the wealthiest foundations. They give grants in the form of like $1 million and $2 million. At 2 p.m., they were holding a webinar for research grants on reducing inequality with a specific focus on studies of strategies to address the structural roots of inequality. And my favorite, because I'm working on 2 of them right now with 2 different groups of faculty, the National Science Foundation, one of the biggest funders of basic research, which is one of my big problems with academia. Too much basic research, trying to just do something for the sake of understanding at the time that we know what global warming is bringing. They put out a call called Racial Equity in STEM Education, and they don't even have an upper limit on the amount of money that one can ask when you apply for this grant. So I'm really excited because, like Regent Begay, I live in a region with 19 pueblos, Native American pueblos, half of the Navajo Nation, her homeland, 3 Apache reservations, and over 50% of the population are Hispanos. So we have a lot of individuals that can really benefit from this opening of inclusiveness and getting more diversity into academia, into innovation, because you never know where the solution to the next problem is going to come from. And we know the problems that are facing us. So I just wanted to present you with what you already see and know. Climate change is huge, it's real. It's going to impact us more and more. Fires, droughts, hurricanes. So this is one instance. The second instance, I'm showing you one individual, because movements don't normally start with one individual. Innovations and solutions to the big problems are not going to happen by one person, one lab, even one discipline. But you've all seen this picture of a little girl in Sweden who began in 2000, I believe, 2018, striking every Friday saying, why do I bother going to school when, you know, climate change is going to impact me, and what am I going to do with all of this education? It's better to focus on what's happening right now. And she's not the only person, obviously. Scientists, people around the world for decades. When I was with the Gorbachev Foundation, climate change was one of the issues that we were working on. But this little girl was able to create a movement among other young people that led to, not that much later, the University of California, again, my alma mater, took $1 billion that it had invested in fossil fuels and extractive energies and pulled it out and decided to divest completely from fossil fuels and invest it into clean energies. That was the University of California. $1 billion is not insignificant. It's a lot of money. But not long after, I just took this from an article last month, Yale, Rutgers, American University, Brown, Columbia, Georgetown, Middlebury, the University of Southern California, USC, I'm sure you've heard of that, University of Cambridge, all of these other academic institutions have followed suit to divest from fossil fuels. I'm not saying Greta Thunberg did that all on her own, but here's one little girl. What hope did she have of creating a movement as one individual? And yet look at the movement she's created. I love this picture because it's a light bulb. And in Spanish, my family would always say, "Se te prendió el foco." In other words, did the light come on? Did you realize? Did you figure it out? Within this light bulb, you have a future that's possible. Are we working toward it? That's what your future is. Your future now is creating this world for the rest of us and for yourselves and your families. So what I want to leave you with is, I am so grateful that you girls are in STEM. And I am so honored to be able to be talking to you today, because I did not pursue the careers that hopefully you will pursue, or whatever career you pursue. My hope is that you will always recognize that you are innovators. You have so many answers. You have everything that you need within you, within your communities, within your networks, and within the world around you to solve these problems, but you're not going to do it alone. Science does not start with I. It is a team effort. And this is where I've come full circle. I'm grateful to be in an academic institution that is giving me the opportunity to pull teams of faculty together from multiple disciplines to talk to each other, to listen to each other, because the social scientists and the humanities and the arts have always been focused on people and communities and society. Maybe STEM, not so much. How many times have engineers come up with great solutions to problems? We're going to create dams, and this is how we're going to control the flow of water. We're going to control nature through dams. And what has that done for our world? It hasn't done very much. So STEM has often tended to be the gods. We have the answers because we're so smart, and we're going to go impose those answers on society. But if they began to look at what does society want? Does society want dams? Do indigenous communities want the clearing of their rainforest to plant, to let cattle graze? Probably not. There are peoples that today, your families, your communities, the rich heritage that you come from, you have your own answers to the problems that you're facing. You know what your needs are. You don't need STEM and engineers and scientists coming into your community saying, we've got the answer. There's a joke in the US among tribal and Native American communities. The two things they fear the most is, we're from the federal government and we're here to help you. And it's not funny. It's funny because that happens a lot. But look what governments have done to indigenous and tribal peoples, around the world and for centuries. So for me, the science of people coming together from multiple disciplines, talking to each other, hearing what the humanists and the artists and the social scientists who've been focused on society from the beginning can teach the engineers and the chemists and the physicists about what society is and how society can benefit from the great things that they can come up with, but only if the community and society wants these innovations. So always remember, you see, this is in the form of a light bulb. Again, el foco. This is what you want to be aiming for, is team science. And the last thing I'm going to read to you is, the other day I was reading this wonderful Issues in Science and Technology. It's put out by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in the US. And it was called The Bipartisan Vision for the Science, for the Future of American Science. And I know I'm talking about a lot of Americanisms. It's the country I live in, and unfortunately, it's where I get a lot of my examples from. But Eddie Bernice Johnson is the most beautiful Black woman who is the chairwoman of the House of Representatives Committee on Science, Space, and Technology. And she's working on a bill to reauthorize the National Science Foundation, that entity funded by the federal government that provides the most funding for basic research. DOD, Department of Defense, Department of Energy fund 10 times, 100 times more, but they're focused more on things like weapons of mass destruction or very specific things. National Foundation lets scientists do whatever kind of STEM research they want to do. And she wrote this in her essay where she's talking about, we need to reauthorize the National Science Foundation. NSF-funded scientists should still be encouraged to pursue their best, most creative, and highest risk ideas. But we know from history of science and innovation that such ideas may be inspired by the desire to meet societal challenges and solve real-world problems. The only quibble that I would have with that is not may, should. We know from the history of science and innovation that such ideas should be inspired by the desire and need to meet societal challenges and solve real-world problems. The pursuit of knowledge and curiosity are not mutually exclusive when the quest is to solve grand challenges or to translate results into use. So I'm here to tell you, I left the sciences a long time ago because I was studying a little molecule on the surface of a cell that had absolutely, to this day, if anybody's taken that up and continued studying this, it's had no utility to solve the problems that we're facing right now with global warming. And yet, if all of that money, hundreds of thousands of dollars, probably approaching $1 million, that was spent on my education alone, not to mention the research that I was doing, the lab that I was in, all of the other researchers around the world. If all of that money and time was focused on solving problems for society, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in. And I urge you, in your own thinking as you go into science, remember that science and innovation can and should be inspired by the desire to meet societal challenges and to solve real world problems. And in your world now and in the future that you're inheriting, that's going to become more and more necessary. I loved this picture where innovation was at the center. And I just want to say, I'm jumping in for 1 hour today to talk to you. There is a group of amazing women who are behind this, who recognize that innovation should be the centerpiece of your 1 month long workshop focus. How phenomenal, because I just stumbled on this myself recently, realizing that innovation is the solution to the problems that we're in. Enough, writing in our journals, getting published in articles that nobody's reading. There's an amazing professor from Latin America named Jose Cerrato, who's at UNM. He's from Honduras, and he won the most prestigious award that the National Science Foundation offers early career scientists. It's called the Career Award. And his research was in the Pueblo of Laguna. And I began to work with the Pueblo of Laguna, trying to, figure out what problems they had, what solutions they might need, that they could work with scientists at UNM. So I found out what Jose was doing, and I made an appointment, and I ran to his office, and his office paper is literally all of his publications. And he said to me, Carmen, look at all of my publications that went into the most prestigious journals. How many people at the Pueblo of Laguna do you think are benefiting from this? I got tenure. I got this prestigious, multi-million-dollar award. My research continues to be funded. And he's looking at something amazing, uranium in the water, because the Pueblo of Laguna is next to Los Alamos National Labs, where the atomic bomb was built. And in order to build it, they had to extract the uranium from the ground of tribal lands. And to this day, the legacy of tribal peoples is cancer from all of the uranium. There are still open mines, wide open, with uranium still leaching out of the soil. So he's trying to look at it, but he's looking at how much is in there, and none of it is actually helping the people. And I can tell you that because he told me that himself. So studies for the sake of studies is not enough. We've got to be innovative and use what we already know. There is so much that's already known about the world around us but what we need, what we've got to do now is use that information to create actual solutions to the problems that you're facing in your communities. And I was hoping